Hello, Frizzle Federation. I'm going to be telling you about the last 10-ish books that I read. And we're going to be going in the order that I read them, except I'm saving the best for last. To end the video on an extra happy note and my biggest recommendation to you. The first book of this batch being Winter's Orbit. I was so jazzed to read this book. I've read another sci-fi romance by this author in the same universe and loved it. So jumping into this one, the expectations were high. This book follows two members of an arranged marriage. They're from the ruling classes of two different planets who are in a treaty together, so their marriage is solidifying this treaty. And neither of them really want to be in this political marriage. For one of them, it's because he never really expected to have to do something like this. He's not mentally prepared for it. And for the other one, he doesn't want to be in this marriage because he just got out of another political marriage where his previous husband died in a tragic accident, and he has a lot of baggage wrapped up because of that. And when I heard that premise, I was a little apprehensive of like, how can we get a love story when the guy is still mourning his past husband? But I do think that that was done well in the book. This story, I really enjoyed the romance. I liked the world building. I really liked how it was so emotion focused, really dealing not only with the sticky conflict between these two people or the political shenanigans going on because of their marriage, but also always focused on how they are feeling about this and the very intense angst all wrapped up in that. But I don't think that this book is quite perfect, and if you're only going to read one of the books in this universe, I would definitely recommend Ocean's Echo, the one I gave 5 stars, because this book, though it does have compelling conflicts, they felt really repetitive by the end. Like it was always the same conflict over and over, and it didn't feel like it was really getting that much development or change. So by 2/3 into this book, I was a little bored. Like, still shipping it, still enjoying my time, but kind of bored. So I'm giving Winter's Orbit 4 stars, and its book tone is Resolution Blue. Book tone is a reader personality test that I designed where you are most likely to enjoy the books that match your type. If you would like to learn more about it or take the test, I've got that all linked in the footnotes for you. The next book that I read was Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. This is a memoir from a physicist who was big in the 1950s, 60s, and I was really looking forward to this memoir because I'm super interested in his life and in his philosophies and all of that stuff. And then this book, I DNF'd it quite quickly because it was just so boring. And like, this guy got up to some really weird, wacky, fun things in his life. But just the way that this book was told, it was just like a bunch of short anecdotes kind of stapled together haphazardly, and it was missing any like connective tissue that I could really grab onto, and more just like here's a list of fun pranks that I pulled on people. So I think I'm gonna give this one 2 stars. Next, I read The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. This follows a woman in modern-day London who is a witch. She really enjoys the act of making potions and using her magic, but she's incredibly lonely because there's a curse on all the witches of the world that they are orphans. So she was raised by like a haphazard string of nannies, and now kind of the only connection she gets is the occasional meetings of the Society of Witches. And they are very emphasized on big secrecy, no friendships, etc. And then she gets an opportunity where she's invited to go tutor 3 little girls. The girls are witches and they need someone to tutor them in magic. Now this is against the rules of the Society of Witches to have so many witches packed into one household, but she decides to go. And then as she's there, she develops relationships with the various people living in this grand house, the 3 girls that she's tutoring, and their team of parental figures also living there. In particular, one hot librarian who's living there. And there starts up a romance between her and him. Now this book was definitely very cute, very fun. It had some interesting world building and twists that I didn't see coming, but definitely the tone overall is very cozy, very warm, and found family all the way through. I thought the romance was just fine, didn't fall head over heels for it, but I was entertained and rooting for them. And I thoroughly loved this book, and I would definitely recommend it for people looking for cozy urban fantasy. I gave The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches 4 stars, and its book tone is jade green. Then I jumped into A Dark and Drowning Tide. This was one of my most highly anticipated books of 2024. It's by an author that I've loved before, and just the premise is so cool. This is a historical fantasy romance, and we are following a woman who studies folklore, and her whole goal with this is to find out where is the origin of magic through tracing all of these folk tales about it. Because she's helping to lead an expedition to go try to find the source of all magic in order to get better power for the kingdom. On this trip with her is also her academic rival. And also quickly into this expedition, one of the party members is murdered. So a close circle murder mystery gets thrown into the mix, and our protagonist and her love interest have to try to solve it kind of as reluctant allies. And I was pretty disappointed in this one. It was readable, but the rivals to lovers, enemies to lovers that this book was trying to sell me on was pitiful. There was very little development of why they hated each other at the beginning of the book. So much so that like throughout the entire first half, I was just kind of like laughing and incredulous of how they were so nasty to each other when there was seemingly no motivation for either of them to do it. I also felt like this book on a technical level was missing a lot of like scene transitions and placing me in locations where I was very unmoored and confused when they were moving from place to place. I enjoyed this book more in the second half once our enemies turned to more lovers and allies, and I had more of a thing to root for there, but it still never reached more than just like, oh, I guess I'm liking this, so 3 stars. And its book tone is Byzantium Purple. I then picked up Elatsoe. I had heard so many fun things about this book. One of the things that I'd heard about this book was that it was following teenage characters and marketed as young adult, but felt more like middle grade when you read it. And having read the book, I fully agree with that sentiment. Like, whenever we were reminded that our main character was like 17, I was shocked. And I think there's 2 parts to that. One, the writing style is very simple and accessible, which in some ways made it very readable and easy to get through. But 2, one of the main things that I think makes this feel more like middle grade than young adult is the angst factor. Usually in young adult books, the angst factor is through the roof. The characters have big emotions and they are all there on the page. And then this book, it was much more restrained, much more where the main character is very mature and doesn't have any big emotional meltdowns, which you might think makes it more into the adult category, but then we have the very simplistic writing style where even down to like the mysteries are very obvious. So, what is this book about? This book is following a teenage girl named Elatsoe, and then one of her cousins mysteriously dies, and then in a dream she talks with his ghost and he says basically, hey, I'm murdered, can you please catch my killer and avenge me? And so she goes on a quest to find the killer and avenge him. And that like high action premise drew me in, but this book is much more like slow paced, where it's really exploring, I'd say, the nature of storytelling and generational heritage, where our protagonist has a big connection to her 6th great grandmother who also had these magic powers and went around the Wild West saving the day with them. And in her family, they're often telling these stories, and those are guiding this quest that Elatsoe is on. Our protagonist has the powers through her Lipan Apache heritage to raise the ghosts of the dead. So she, for example, has a dog who is a ghost now. And though there was nothing wrong with this book on like a technical level, and I can see why so many people love it, I never really connected to the character. I think in part because of that low angst factor of like, it felt too low stakes in that there weren't big emotional reactions to things. There just like wasn't quite enough like internal conflict for me to fall in love with this book. So I'm giving Elatsoe 3 stars, and its book tone is international orange. Then I read Once We Flew. This is a very adventurous sci-fi novella where we're following a group of settlers on this desert planet. And when you live on this desert planet for a few years, the sand crystals start growing inside of you. And these do 2 things. 1, they give you oftentimes psychic powers. And 2, they slowly kill you. And we're following a woman who is slowly dying from this crystal infestation. And so our protagonist sets off on this trek across the desert that she doesn't know if she's ever really going to come back from, but she feels like she owes it to her friend to try. I felt like this novella was exceptionally well paced. It had a great balance of giving us the character arc and emotions of our protagonist, the survivalist plot as she goes questing across the desert, and the world building of what is life like on this disastrous space colony. So I gave Once We Flew 4 stars, and its book tone is anchor gray. Then I jumped into Witness for the Dead. This is a, let's call it low fantasy because the magic elements are pretty small, but it does take place in a kingdom of elves and goblins. We are following a priest, a witness for the dead, and he can talk to the ghosts of recently deceased. And he uses this power to both perform things like funeral rites and to help solve murder mysteries. And that is the hook that I was so excited to see play out in this book. I was a little disappointed that we didn't have a lot of solving murder mystery energy because it's much more a slow-paced exploration of just this man's life, of how it's hard for him to make connections with people because they're weirded out by his power, and of how it's hard for him to get a place in both the governmental and priest hierarchy because he's a little bit outside of both of those, and the power struggles that happen around him because of that. The result is a slow and melancholy book with just enough plot, never to be really boring, but also not quite enough plot or real character arc development for me to be truly obsessed with it. But I did enjoy my time, and I'm excited to jump into the sequel and follow more adventures with this protagonist. And I hope that we get more murder mystery energy, but I think I need to lower my expectations. So, 4 stars for Witness for the Dead. And the book tone is Thistle Purple. I then jumped into Paladin's Grace. I am so intrigued at the world-building premise of this book. So we are following a paladin, a holy knight who swore himself to the god of berserkers. And then at the beginning of the book, the god dies. And him and his other paladin buddies are left without a god to guide them, but they still have these berserker abilities, except now their killing sprees aren't guided by a benevolent deity, and so they've become much more dangerous all of a sudden. So all these paladins are left adrift, feeling very dangerous and cut off from society, and just kind of struggling to find a new place. Fast forward to a few years later, they found a new place working for these priest lawyer people, and he's doing simple bodyguarding tasks around the city for them. When he runs into his love interest, because this is a fantasy romance, and she is a perfumer. She's trying real hard to establish herself in the city, and she takes great pride in her craft. And also, she's kind of running away from a terrible ex-husband. And then they are both witness to a mysterious murder, which gets their orbits intersecting and kickstarts them getting to know each other, and also trying to solve this murder thing. And I really appreciate that we have this mature, slow-paced fantasy romance here, but it just didn't click with me, and I think a lot of that is because the humor style, and of course, humor is so subjective, so just because it doesn't work for me doesn't mean it wouldn't be your new favorite book. But so much of this book hinges on being entertaining because of its humor, and that humor so much hinges on awkward social interactions and like inconvenient horniness and slapstick comedy, and none of those I really find all that funny. I mean, of course it depends on the thing, but like I was rolling my eyes at this book more than I was laughing along with it, you know? I definitely shipped a couple, but this humor style just doesn't work for me. So I gave Paladin's Grace 3 stars, and its book tone is Byzantium Purple. Now, I picked this book out of my TBR jar, which means it's time to pick another. These are books that have been submitted to me by my patrons, and I get to pick one out, and I have to read it. And this has been a very fun adventure. I've done 3 books so far, and they've all been 3 stars. And I'm very glad that none of them have been worse than that, and I just hope we can keep that streak of at least liking the books going. And hopefully we find an even better than like in here. If you would like to submit a name to the jar, you can sign up to be one of my patrons either here on YouTube memberships, or the higher tiers are on Ko-fi. So, I think this is our one for today. Let's see what I'm gonna read. From Amy's Rambles, we have The Imaginary Corpse by Tyler Hayes. I've never heard of this one. It follows one of the cutest protagonists written, a sunshine yellow triceratops stuffed toy. I'm intrigued. It's cute and dark and fluffy and heart-wrenching and all the contradictions in between. I'm excited to give this one a try. I've definitely enjoyed books that balance dark and cute and fluffy before, so let's hope that this one is also a winner. I then read Howl's Moving Castle. This was a reread for me. I first read it like a decade ago, and returning to it was very fun. This follows a girl named Sophie, and she gets cursed by a wicked witch to become an old woman. And then she sets off on a quest, kind of just to start a new life for herself, but also hoping to find a cure for her curse. And in her quest, she stumbles across the moving castle of the wizard Howl, rumored to be the most wicked wizard who eats the hearts of young ladies. And this book is certainly a fun romp. It doesn't get too serious, and there are lots of magical adventures. I think a sizable portion of my love for this book is me projecting on it the vibes and the characters from the Studio Ghibli movie adaptation of the book, because that adaptation in some ways is weaker than the novel. In the novel, the plot makes more sense. More things are better explained, it's easier to follow what's happening. And I also think it has better pacing in some ways. The movie, however, much more nails the characters and the relationships and the emotions and the vibes of it all. So anyway, I think I'm gonna give the book 4 stars. And its book tone is Vermilion Red. And this was the book we read as a patron book club. We have discussions on Discord and a YouTube live show. And this is the book we are going to be reading next. So now we are at the last book of the video. It is time for me to talk about my favorite book that I read in this batch. And this goes to a trilogy that took over my life for a few weeks and I am thoroughly obsessed with, which is The Scholomance, starting with A Deadly Education. This series is a young adult fantasy. We are following a young witch who has a talent for spells of mass destruction. Those come very easy to her. If she wanted to murder a bunch of people all at once, easy peasy. What doesn't come so easy to her is simple spells like cleaning her room. And what also doesn't come very easy to her is making friends. She's had a very difficult childhood that's been made even trickier as she's now at magical boarding school, where all of the other students can sense her malevolent aura and avoid her because of it. And because she's like internalized all of this shunning and trauma, she just like doesn't even try to make friends and instead is incredibly rude to everyone, which of course exacerbates the entire cycle of it all. The boarding school is very interesting where it's deadly. There are monsters in all of the halls, the walls, the ceilings, the floors, the pipes. This school has a very high death rate, and if you get out of it, then you're ready for the real world, where there is theoretically even more monsters out there waiting for you. So that drives a lot of the conflict in these books, and also the inter-character relationships, as everyone is always watching their back and so paranoid about the monster that's about to jump out at you, which I thought was exceptionally well done at raising the stakes in these books. Then enter an extra conflict into these books, as we get a prominent side character, a boy who has a talent for destroying the monsters. He's got quite a hero complex. He's always saving everyone in the school, and then him and our protagonist start butting heads, where he is Golden Boy hero and she is Black Cat, villain status pending. And I love their dynamic so much. Of course, I ship it. The book series doesn't always make it easy to ship them. The romance in these books isn't like super prominent, but it was one of my favorite parts of the series. I gave the first book 5 stars. It was my favorite of the bunch. The second book also 5 stars, and the third book 4 stars. So this series doesn't quite reach the heights of all 5 stars, one of my favorite series of all time, but it did get quite close, and I'd highly recommend it, especially if you love following a prickly, rude protagonist who slowly learns how to make friends. And their book tone is Gainsborough Grey. Thank you for watching, and I recommend if you liked this video, watching another one of my recent reads videos like this one.